Oh, show me Mr. Stratton's bank account. Bet you can't do that.
Listen, kid, you know, I'm kind of busy. I gotta make it. All right.
Do you remember the train running through the living room, a house full of arcade machines and toys? That was what made Silver Spoons different from so many other sitcoms of the early 80s. It felt like a childhood dream turned into television, a world where everything was bright, cheerful, and seemingly perfect. But that was only what we saw on screen. Because behind that fairy tale house was a whole string of stories stranger than most people ever imagined. One young face that caused trouble for the entire show, backstage pranks wild enough to damage a Hollywood icon, and one truth near the top of this list that may make you look back at the entire success of Silver Spoons in a completely different way. Today, we are going to open the door to that house again and uncover the 15 weirdest facts about Silver Spoons. And trust me, you are not ready for just how strange these facts are. Let us begin. Number 15. Silver Spoons almost became an adult show. Want to know the strangest thing about Silver Spoons? It is this: it almost was meant for adults and adults only. We still remember this show as a charming family sitcom from early 80s American television. But that was not the show NBC had in mind at the beginning. What they were developing back then was something much closer to Arthur the Hit movie from 1981 about an eccentric rich man, except this television version would strip away the drinking and the uselessness. Just thinking about that is strange enough already. Because if that idea had stayed in place, Silver Spoons probably would have gone down a road that was more adult, more sour, and maybe a lot colder than the version audiences later carried into memory. Then, the show changed direction. The original model slowly turned into Joel Higgins's Edward Stratton III, and after NBC decided to reshape the whole project into a star vehicle. For Ricky Schroder, the entire frame of the series changed with it. It became lighter, younger, warmer, and most importantly, it started to have a heart. To me, that was one of the smartest decisions American television made in that era. Honestly, I still feel relieved whenever I think about that turn, because if NBC had kept the original plan, we probably would have gotten just one more odd sitcom about some eccentric rich man. What we got instead, thankfully, was the real Silver Spoons, a show with Ricky at the center, with a warmth all its own, and with that fairy tale quality no other sitcom ever managed to imitate properly. And once they decided to turn it into a true childhood dream, they were smart enough to place right in the middle of that house something powerful enough to make a whole generation of kids stare without blinking. And that thing came with a weird truth of its own. Can you guess what it was? Number 14. The train everybody loved on Silver Spoons was the thing that scared Ricky. If you grew up with Silver Spoons, I think there is one thing that is almost certain. You may forget a plot point. You may mix up a few supporting characters, but you will not forget the train that ran through the Stratton house. For kids and teenagers back then, it stopped being just a set detail. It was the thing that made the whole house feel like a real dream. The second it glided through the living room, everything rose above the level of an ordinary family sitcom. And that is why I have always thought that train was never just a fun decoration. It was the central visual hook of the whole series. From the moment the premise was introduced, the show was almost telling the audience outright that this was not a house you would find in any other sitcom. This was the world of Silver Spoons, and that world was built out of the very things kids of that era could only sit and stare at and wish for. And of course, that train was not fake. It was a real steam engine. Ricky Schroder said in a Glamour interview in 2015 that it was genuinely huge, genuinely heavy, and genuinely dangerous because of the enormous air pressure inside it. But the most interesting part of all is that while most people on the set loved riding the train, Ricky himself, the boy living inside that dream every week, was the one who felt uneasy about the danger it carried. Funny, is it not? A whole generation sat in front of the screen, wishing they could touch it just once, while the boy at the very center of the show was the one most wary of it. And then, like with a lot of successful shows from that era, not everything on the set stayed quietly in its proper place. At one point, a face that seemed to be standing off to the side started pulling more attention than the producers wanted. Number 13. Jason Bateman got so popular that Silver Spoons had to change course. This may be the thing Silver Spoons fans could argue about forever, because Derek Taylor was not the kind of faded supporting character who gets brought in just to make Ricky Schroder look good. Jason Bateman walked into that show with the very thing television has always both wanted and feared: natural charisma. He was sharper, slicker, harder to predict, and the minute he showed up, the energy of a scene changed. For a sitcom built very clearly as a vehicle for Ricky, that was not a small detail. That was a problem. Ricky was the center NBC had chosen, the face the show was built around from the start. There is no debating that. But Derek was the kind of character who made the audience start looking away from the main axis. And once that starts happening in American sitcoms from that era, especially on a show built around a child star, producers usually do not see it as richness. They see it as risk. The story retold years later is that the producers started worrying. Jason Bateman was overshadowing Ricky Schroder, and then Derek disappeared after season 2. And this is where it really gets interesting, because Bateman did not disappear from television at all. He moved on to It's Your Move Then, Valerie. In other words, if people felt this kid was too magnetic to stay parked in a supporting slot, later, history suggests they were not wrong. At the end of the day, a show can preserve order by removing a character who is getting too much attention, but sometimes the price is cutting away the very electricity that kept the audience from looking away. And if you watch closely enough, old sitcoms are always giving away their secrets in little details like that. Number 12. The Stratton doorbell actually came from another classic sitcom. This is the kind of thing that gives me a real kick when I go back to old sitcoms. Not a backstage scandal, not some giant twist. Just a tiny moment, very quick. So quick that if you blink or let your mind drift for a second, it is gone. I was rewatching Silver Spoons, heard the Stratton doorbell ring, and suddenly stopped. That sound was way too familiar. Familiar in that way that makes you sit up a little straighter and ask yourself, hold on, where have I heard that before? Then I realized it. The Stratton doorbell sounds exactly like the doorbell in George and Louise's apartment on the Jeffersons. What makes that even more fun is that it is not some absurd coincidence. The two shows shared the same producer and director, so that detail feels like a tiny leftover trace from the same old television world still sitting there on screen. That is the thing I have always loved about Golden Age American sitcoms. On the surface, each show has its own house, its own family, its own rhythm. But look just a little more closely, and you start seeing the stitching. And it is those stitches that make the whole tapestry even better. Go ahead and check it for yourself. Pull up a scene from Silver Spoons, then find a clip from the Jeffersons. I will bet that once you catch it, you will never hear that bell the same way again. Number 11. The boy who seemed born for the spotlight once froze in front of the studio audience. If Ricky Schroder had not told this story himself years later, I believe most viewers never would have guessed it, because when you watch Silver Spoons on screen, you see a boy standing right at the center of the show with a level of ease that almost looks effortless. Ricky never comes across like a child struggling to keep up. He is simply there, solid bright, exactly where he belongs, as if a television set was where he had been meant to be all along. That is exactly why this is so memorable. Early on, Ricky was so afraid of the studio audience that he almost froze up. I have always thought television has a wonderful magic trick built into it. People at home look at the screen and think everything is weightless. A boy says a line. The audience laughs, the cameras move, and that is that. But standing inside a multi-camera sitcom is not light at all. There are blazing hot lights overhead. There is laughter exploding right in front of you. There are hundreds of eyes locked on you, waiting for you to say the line on time, stand on the mark, not lose your breath, not miss the rhythm. Grown adults can get knocked sideways by that pressure. So imagine what that does to a boy who is not even grown yet. Every time I hear this story again, I admire him more. In the end, that boy really did do a terrific job. Ricky deserves a good, honest compliment down in the comments. Go ahead and do that before I move to the next fact. Number 10. Silver Spoons did not just have one version. A lot of people remember Silver Spoons as if it was simply there through one long stretch of childhood, unbroken, never switching tracks. That makes sense. You turned it on, and there was the same house, the same train, the same world that felt a little too beautiful to be real, but charming enough to make you believe it anyway. So memory naturally stitches it all together into one continuous ribbon. But the show's broadcast life was not that seamless. Silver Spoons began on NBC, then later stepped into a second life in syndication. Put simply, it left the familiar national network and kept living in the way American television of that era was very good at doing, sending an established sitcom into a new phase of life. What kept a lot of people from noticing that shift is that on screen, Silver Spoons still looked like Silver Spoons. The show did not suddenly turn into something strange and unrecognizable. It held on to enough familiar elements that the audience simply felt it was still going. And let us be honest, back then, who sat in front of the television asking whether they were watching the NBC years or the syndication years? People just knew the show was still there, and that was enough. Number 9. Even the Silver Spoons theme song changed with the years. People love saying they remember a sitcom theme song perfectly, as if one note starts and they can sing the whole thing straight through. I do not entirely buy that. Most of us do not remember every note. We remember the feeling it left behind. With Silver Spoons, that feeling is so strong that a lot of people miss a very simple fact. The song together did not stay the same throughout the life of the show. Just listen carefully and you can hear it. The early version sounds lighter, brighter, with an innocence that feels exactly right for the early 80s. Then slowly, the sound begins to change. The arrangement gets glossier, more electronic, much more in step with the middle of the 80s. By the later period, it even has a different bounce to it, almost as if the show itself is adjusting its collar in the mirror so it will not get left behind by the times. Still, together. Yes, but not quite the same feeling anymore. Number 8. Derek always acted cool, but his music taste was older than people would guess. I do not think any of us could ever forget Derek Taylor. He was the kid who walked into a room and instantly acted like he knew more than everybody else there. Jason Bateman played that kind of role with remarkable ease. Can you believe that a boy who always wanted to seem so cool, always half a step ahead of everybody else, was actually a fan of early rock and roll, not the newest sound? Not the music shouting youth at the top of its lungs, but music that already carried the scent of an earlier time. That mismatch makes Derek much more interesting. On the outside, he looked like the kind of kid who had been born knowing how to roll his eyes, twist a line, hit the exact nerve, then pull back with that half smile. But his music taste says something else. It shows that underneath that slick little shell was a taste all his own, older, more classic, and not at all what most people would guess from a quick glance. And among the names Derek liked, one stands out more than the others: Paul Anka. Just hearing that already feels a little delightful. A boy trying so hard to look modern and yet leaning toward a singer associated with an older, softer, more elegant musical world. But the more interesting part is this. Years after Silver Spoons, Jason Bateman married Amanda Anka, the daughter of Paul Anka himself. At that point, the joke practically writes the rest of itself. The boy on screen had a music taste older than his image suggested, then grew up and literally stepped into the family of the very name tied to that taste. If a sitcom had invented that connection on purpose, people might have complained the writers were laying it on too thick. Every now and then, Hollywood really does hand you details that are amusing enough to make you look back years later, laugh, and say, the whole thing was a remarkable coincidence. Number 7. There was a point when silver spoons had to be relit almost from scratch. You look at silver spoons and see a dream house. But for the people who actually work in the business, a show like that reveals something very different. Around 1983, when Donald A. Morgan walked onto stage 43 at Universal to take over as director of photography on Silver Spoons, he said he was still feeling his way through that first time in charge, but all it took was one look around for him to know the show had not been set up the right way. What makes it even more interesting is that Morgan did not talk around it like a man who had just been handed a big assignment. He asked the producers for exactly 2 hours, then had everything shut down so he could start over from the beginning. That is the kind of decision that only has 2 possible outcomes. Either you know exactly what you are doing, or you are digging your own hole right there in the middle of the soundstage. In Morgan's case, it was very clearly the first one. After that hard turn, he said everything started running more smoothly. Morgan said outright sitcoms in those days were often too flat and too bright, and he wanted to bring in more depth, something closer to the cinematic feeling he had in mind. By the end of that first year on Silver Spoons, he saw that stretch as a major leap in his craft, the place where he learned how to bring finer lighting qualities into that multi-camera world that could so easily wind up feeling dull and lifeless. Number 6. Silver Spoons was almost built to turn Ricky Schroder into a television star. Some child actors are invited into a show. Ricky Schroder did not come in that way. With Silver Spoons, that boy was almost the reason the whole machine got built in the first place. TV Guide said it plainly, this was a Schroder vehicle after the success of The Champ, meaning a show built around Ricky, not a role he simply happened to step into. And honestly, American television back then rarely made a half-hearted bet once it saw a face that could sell both likability and star power. The reason they went that hard is not difficult to understand. Ricky had already won the Golden Globe for The Champ in the New Star of the Year category, and the Golden Globes themselves noted that he was the youngest person ever to win that category at just 9 years old. That was not the kind of child who had only just gotten a little attention and was waiting to see if he could go any further. That was a movie child star already wearing a medal on his chest, stepping into television, with the whole system already making room for him. And the truth is, Silver Spoons did not just help Ricky stay famous. It completely changed the way America saw him. On the big screen, The Champ made audiences emotional. On television, Silver Spoons turned him into the face viewers welcomed into their living rooms every week. The Golden Globes noted that 3 years after that win, Ricky had become a familiar public name thanks to the lead role in Silver Spoons. And TV Guide reported that right there on the set, when Ricky spoke up about how a scene should be handled, the adults listened. That was no longer a little boy hitting his mark and reading lines. That was a child sitting in the center seat of the show. We are down to the final 5 facts on today's list. Before we count them down, hit the like button and get ready for things to get even stranger from here. Number 5. Silver Spoons was rejected by NBC, but recognized by Hollywood. There is an old rule in American television. A network may let go of a show. Hollywood almost never lets go of something that is still printing money. Silver Spoons is a perfect example of that rule. When NBC stopped the show after the 4th season, most viewers simply assumed it had reached the end of its life on a major network. But behind the scenes, the story took a completely different turn. Instead of disappearing, Silver Spoons was moved into a new life in syndication, and that decision was actually made about 1 year earlier than originally planned. And that is when the numbers started speaking louder than feelings. Sitcoms that reached the level of Silver Spoons could be sold in major markets for hundreds of thousands of dollars per episode. Multiply that across the country, and the value of each episode could reach into the millions. That is the point where a show is no longer living only by this week's ratings or next week's ratings. It starts living off its own episode library. So, looking back, Silver Spoons moving into syndication was not some last-minute miracle rescue. It was a very clear-eyed television business decision. Once a show is familiar enough, has enough episodes, and has a loyal enough audience, nobody is in a hurry to let go of it. Hollywood may change the time slot, but when something can still sell, they always find a way to keep it running. Number 4. Silver Spoons got from first draft to television faster than most people realize. People tend to have a very understandable illusion about the shows they still remember decades later. We look back at a familiar sitcom, see how neatly everything works, the large sets, the clearly defined characters, and naturally assume it must have been cooked for a long time, like a meal left over a low flame all day until it reached exactly the right flavor. But if you look at Silver Spoons on the actual calendar, the story is very different. The first draft of the pilot script was dated March 17, 1982. And by September 25, 1982, the show was already on the air at NBC. From first draft to national television in just over half a year. For American network television, that is practically a sprint. The reality was just that. Early 80s American television had a very clear habit. If they smelled an idea that could run, they did not sit around staring at it for too long. They built it fast and let the audience decide the rest. Silver Spoons is a perfect example of that method. The idea appears, the machine turns on, and only a few months later, the show is standing in front of millions of viewers. Number 3. Alfonso Ribeiro came to Silver Spoons from a Broadway stage. Before stepping into the Stratton house, Alfonso Ribeiro had already been standing on a much bigger stage. In the early 80s, that young boy got noticed on Broadway in the musical The Tap Dance Kid. If you have ever gone back and watched Ribeiro performing from that time, you understand immediately why. He tap danced like the stage had been built specifically for his feet. Fast, precise, and carrying a kind of confidence that is very rare in a child. What makes it interesting is that he was not discovered in some television audition room. According to The Ringer, the story began right there in a Broadway theater. Veteran actress Nell Carter saw him in the show Turn to the Man, then running NBC, Brandon Tartikoff, and said something very simple: "You ought to sign that kid." Hollywood sometimes loves telling long stories about discovering talent. The truth is often much shorter. Somebody with a real eye sees the right person at the right moment. Number 2. Two of the child stars on Silver Spoons once ruined Hollywood's most famous shark. There may be no faster way to destroy the menace of the shark from Jaws than letting two 11-year-old boys wade around in its pond. Jason Bateman once told a story that is almost hard to believe. Back when he and Ricky Schroder were working on Silver Spoons, they had a pastime that was pure Hollywood kid. The two of them would ride bikes around the Universal backlot, grab onto the studio trams, then one day made their way over to the Jaws Lagoon. If you have ever seen that area, you know the whole point was to make visitors believe a giant great white shark was lurking under that water. Those two boys had a different idea. Bateman said the two of them rolled up their pants, stepped into the water that was only about knee-deep, and started scooping up goldfish. Not sharks. Goldfish. They stuffed them into plastic bags like they had just discovered a secret fishing pond right in the middle of Hollywood. Not surprisingly, the studio had to send a letter home to their parents. The message was basically that the studio was trying to make people afraid of a giant shark and these two boys had just destroyed the entire illusion. And if that story is strange enough for the number 2 spot, the fact sitting at the very end of the list brings a completely different kind of surprise. Because when people look at the commercial success of Silver Spoons, they naturally assume the show must have been chased by the major awards. The truth is a little different. Number 1. Silver Spoons and the Emmy Awards almost never connected. If you look only at the cultural memory of the show, everything about it feels like a major sitcom of the 80s. It had a famous child star. It had a very distinctive visual world. It ran for years. And most importantly, a great many people still remember it. So, the natural audience reaction is this. A show like that must have gotten a lot of Emmy attention. The truth is almost the opposite. Over the entire life of Silver Spoons, the show received only one primetime Emmy nomination. Not for Ricky Schroder, not for acting, not for writing, not for Best Sitcom. That one and only nomination was for lighting. Some shows are born to please awards voters. Other shows are born to live in the audience's living room. Silver Spoons very clearly belong to the second group. Silver Spoons has always been one of those shows that fascinates me in a very particular way. Maybe because it carries exactly the kind of magic 80s American television used to do so well. A house where a train could run through the living room. A world where arcade machines, toys, and a child's imagination all seemed allowed to live together in the same frame. But what makes me like the show even more came years later, once I started peeling back the stories behind it. From network decisions to production, turns to weird little anecdotes that could only happen in Hollywood. The deeper you dig, the more interesting the show becomes. Not just a sweet childhood sitcom, but a very smart television machine built at exactly the right time. If you enjoy digging back into classic television shows like this too, do not forget to subscribe so we can keep doing these fascinating excavations together. I will see you in the next video.